Welcome to Channel 4 News at 6. I'm your host, Scott Freeman. On December 12, 1963, the country of Kenya officially won its independence from Great Britain after many years of struggle. Today, December 12, 2013, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of this event. First, we will hear from our analyst, John Ross, about the colonial background of Kenya.
John Ross here, talking about the background of the colony of Kenya. The basis of the conflict dates back to the 19th century. In 1895, Kenya was declared a protectorate of the British. They were later proclaimed a colony in 1920. After World War I, Britain began to apply more and more taxes upon the people of British East Africa, which included present-day Kenya. This, combined with reduced wages, new experiences gained from fighting in the war, and an increase in white settlers, led to new movements. Among these movements were the Voice of the People movement and the Young Kikuyu Association, started by Harry Thuku. This particular movement brought a sense of nationalism to many of the Kikuyu. During and after the 1920s, the KCA, or Kikuyu Central Association, made aims to unify the Kikuyu into one unified state, but it failed. In the late 1930s, the British government began to change marketing controls, making educational supervision stricter and changing land ownerships. The government had been trying to modernize the country, taking older traditional leaders out of the equation and educating young men in the ways of English living. After the war, many upper-class British officers were given free land in an attempt to garner more interest from white settlers and speed up the modernization of the colony. At this point in the history of Kenya, there were roughly 30,000 British settlers living in this country. All of these men were given a say in the politics of the colony, but the more than 1 million members of the Kikuyu tribe were given no say. They were not even considered real landowners, seen simply as itinerant farmers for the far superior white minority who took more and more land away from the African people. As a result of this oppression, many fled the country for cities, attempting to find work to supply food for themselves and their families.
It's Scott Freeman again, and I am now here to discuss Kenya's road to independence. Resistance to the British was present from the start in Kenya. The native Kikuyu people showed great opposition from 1880 to 1900. Another example was the resistance was the Nandi Revolt, which lasted from 1895 to 1905. The Giriama Uprising, which lasted from 1913 to 1914, also showed resistance to the British. Later on in 1947, Kenyan women revolted against the forced labor, and in 1950, the Kaloa Affray took place. The Kenyans' fight for independence lasted throughout the entire period of British colonial control. During World War II, British used Kenya as a military base and even employed 98,000 Kenyans as soldiers known as askaris. After the war, the veterans sought to maintain their employment and sought middle-class employment in the colony. Kenya, which had also increased its own defense during the war, sought more socioeconomic gains to modernize the country. Kenya emerged from the war with more power and interest in increasing that power. Kikuyu people in Kenya also had their own personal farming techniques in the mid-1900s. The British sought to modernize their methods and transform it into a commercial agriculture and move the people into the cities. The Kikuyus still believed in their traditional farming units and sought to remain self-sufficient and stay away from the large market. They strongly resisted any attempts at agrarian reform made by the British. In 1944, Harry Thuku founded the Kenya African Study Union, which became the Kenya African Union in 1946. This African national group, dominated by the Kikuyu people, demanded more land from the whites. They also wanted Africans to have a larger say in Kenya's government. Jomo Kenyatta was elected president of the KAU in 1947 and demanded that Africans have more government positions in Kenya. After much pressure, the British were forced to allow a multiracial government in Kenya. It consisted of 14 Europeans, 1 Arab, and 6 Asian elected members, and along with 6 African and 1 Arab that were chosen by the governor. Later on, the Mau Mau Uprising, which lasted from 1952 to 1956, also showed resistance to the British. The Mau Mau movement was a movement against the British colonialism that set the groundwork for the later attainment of independence. The Mau Mau people were Kikuyus that were seen as radical opponents to colonialism. The British viewed them as savage and an unorganized tribal cult. However, not all Kikuyus were part of the Mau Mau movement. About the same amount of Kikuyus fought against the Mau Mau as those that fought with them. Some view it as a Kenyan civil war. During the uprising, the British placed many Kikuyus in screening camps. A system known as the pipeline was organized by the British. The detainees would move to different positions along the pipeline according to their cooperation. Much like the Nazi extermination camps of World War II, These camps were unsanitary and the detainees were forced into labor and many died as a result. Many compare it to the Russian Gulag. The uprising ended on October 21st, 1956, when Dedan Kimathi, the rebel leader, was captured. One British officer described an experience he had during the Mau Mau uprising. I stuck my revolver right in his grinning mouth, and I said something. I don't remember what, and I pulled the trigger. His brains went all over the side of the police station. The two other Mickeys, Mau Mau, were standing there looking blank. I said to them that if they didn't tell me where to find the rest of the gang, I'd kill them too. They didn't say a word, so I shot them both. One wasn't dead, so I shot him in the ear. When the sub-inspector drove up, I told him that the Mickeys tried to escape. He didn't believe me, but all he said was, bury them and see the wall is cleared up. The Mau Mau uprising resulted in numerous atrocities in the indigenous people of Kenya. As a concession, Great Britain provided for elections of 6 African members to the Legislative Council, increasing African representation. In 1960, the Kenya African National Union, KANU, led by Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, was formed as a new party in Kenya. Kenyatta led the KANU in the first and second Lancaster houses in London. In these conferences, which took place in 1961 and 1962, Kenya's independence constitution was negotiated. In May 1963, elections were held in Kenya again. Kenyatta's KANU faced off against the Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU. Kenyatta and the KANU won, winning 83 seats, while the KADU only won 41. On June 1st, 1963, Kenyatta became the Prime Minister of Kenya. Later that year, on December 12th, Kenya became officially independent from Great Britain when a constitutional agreement was signed in the Third Lancaster House Conference. We now will go to a short commercial break. We're all friends, and we all have iPod Touches. And you should really buy one. They're really awesome. Go to your local store. Maybe Target. Maybe Best Buy. Or maybe Walmart, and they will sell an iPod Touch, and you can buy one there. Don't forget to buy one. Bye. Andrew Narahara will now discuss Kenya after independence and the rulers of Kenya since their break from Great Britain.
Alright. I'm political analyst Andrew Narahara. After Kenya's independence, Kenyatta had Parliament amend their constitution, making Kenya a republic. Under this new system, Kenyatta became president. He was therefore head of state, government, and commander-in-chief of Kenya's military. Kenyatta kept up friendly relations with the British, urging their settlers to remain in Kenya, keeping their jobs, and requesting the British military's aid in putting down rebellions at home and against Somalian rebels. He was also very anti-communist, frequently warning his people of the dangers of communism. Since Kenya was previously part of Britain, the main ally of the US, they were naturally against communism and therefore the Soviet Union, before Kenyatta's rule. Kenyatta remained president until his death in 1978. During his presidency, Kenyatta effectively made Kenya a one-party state, with himself as its leader. His regime is suspected of murdering his political rivals. He ran unopposed after his first election because only he was allowed to run. To maintain his position, Kenyatta strategically placed his friends in high offices and made use of detention for people who were suspected of being against him. However, the West supported Kenyatta because he was so against communism in the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, Kenya was seen by the West as an important democratic country that held back socialist tendencies in nearby countries like Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Uganda. After Kenyatta's death, his vice president, Daniel Totorich Arap Moi, took over as president. He was very popular and very anti-communist. Moi, unlike Kenyatta, was very open, frequently touring the country. However, Moi carried on Kenyatta's system, running unopposed in every election until 1992. He used secret police to keep out communists and retain control, infiltrating groups which fought for democratic reforms, torturing people in secret torture chambers, and prohibiting the teaching of Marxism. Because Moi was so anti-communist, like Kenyatta, the West supported him, even deliberately ignoring Moi's horrible torture chambers. In late 1982, Moi put down a military coup by members of his own Air Force. After the coup, he dismantled Kenyatta's Air Force and court-martialed many of the rebels. In 1992, the first multi-party elections were held in Kenya since 1963, and Moi again came out on top. He remained president until the 2002 elections, where he was prohibited from running for a third term in the multi-party elections by Kenya's constitution. The presidency of Kenya went to Mwai Kibaki, Moi's vice president. Kibaki is still the president of Kenya today. Now, back to Scott.
Thank you, Andrew. And now we move to another short commercial break.
Come to the Extreme Ping Pong Club on 80th Street in New Hampshire.
We now go to Nick Bradford for his insights on Kenya in modern times.
Thank you, Scott. I'm reporter Nick Bradford, reporting live from Kenya. Since independence, Kenya has maintained considerable stability despite changes in its political system and crises in neighboring countries, helped by the resurgence of multi-party democracy and increased freedoms such as freedom of speech. In 2007, however, during the presidential election between Kibaki of the National Party of Unity and Raila Odinga of the Orange Democratic Movement, dispute over the results led to protests and revived old tensions, soon escalating into ethnic violence and property destruction. Over 1,000 people were killed and nearly 600,000 forced to move from their homes. However, a peaceful solution between the two political parties was eventually reached. Kibaki remained president, while Odinga was made prime minister, and a grand coalition cabinet that included over 40 ministers from both parties was formed. Kenya is currently a presidential representative democratic republic, and has been undergoing a series of constitutional reforms to create a more balanced system of government. Today, Kenya is in dire need of new infrastructure, increased crime control, and improved economic governance. The government has put into effect a plan called Vision 2030 that will hopefully address these issues, but the plan may not be fully completed due to political reasons. Economically, corruption is Kenya's biggest inhibitor to economic stability. The country has a 46% impoverishment rate and has a 40% unemployment rate. There is obscenely high inflation, which has routinely been above 9% yearly for the last decade and peaked at 26% in 2009. Agriculture employs 75% of the working population in the production of tea, coffee, wheat, sugarcane, fruits, vegetables, dairy products, but only produces 20% of the gross domestic product, of which 60% is in services and another significant portion is in tourism. With a hugely underdeveloped industry, the over-reliance on agriculture makes Kenya's economy highly reactive to international financial conditions, and it has to import most of its consumer goods. Its agriculture has been harmed by the continuation of traditional instead of modern farming methods, and large environmental challenges including drought, deforestation, shifting climate patterns, cattle overgrazing, a very high population growth rate, and a high AIDS mortality rate. Despite so much of the country being involved in food production, Kenya has been receiving emergency food assistance for large portions of the population for several years, and it is estimated that it will continue requiring it in the foreseeable future. Kenya also receives large amounts of foreign financial aid from the IMF and the World Bank, as well as from the US, which donates to Kenya's apparel industry. However, some previous governments have imposed restrictions on foreign investments in the past to promote Africanization of trade, which has severely harmed Kenya's economy. However, despite all these severe economic problems, Kenya remains this day remarkably stable politically, and it is still the economic trade hub in East Africa.
From all of us here at Channel 4 News, we thank you and hope you enjoyed the program. You stay classy, planet Earth.